Hey everybody, welcome back to another in a series of Shane Plays D&D and RPG videos. I always like to do these. We get good feedback on them, and I'm working to find the time to keep them coming even more often. This week, and I'll get into it here in a second, but we're going to be doing Timeless Advice from the Keep on the Borderlands by Creighton Broadhurst, and I'll give him more of a shout out here in a moment, make sure he gets his credit. And we're going to be talking about DM advice and player advice that came directly from Keep on the Borderlands, which is a classic module. It's like 40 years old. So many D&D players back in the day played it because it came free with the basic set of D&D for a while. So we're going to be getting to that. We can talk about is it timeless? Does this advice still hold up? Do I agree with his advice? Do I not? So it'll be kind of interesting to go through it. But I also want to give a shout out. We have a new Patreon supporter, and that is Chris Williams. Thank you so much, Chris, for supporting the Shane Plays RPG D&D videos Patreon. I'll put the link for that Patreon in the show notes. But basically, we're up to, I think, roughly $40 a month in support on that right now, which I appreciate very much. And at $25 a month, I said, I'll guarantee at least one video a month. I believe at $75 a month, we'll go to 2 videos a month. And that doesn't mean that I'll only do that. There may be months where I do more, but based on the Patreon level of support, I will do a minimum. And right now I'm on a minimum of a video a month for tabletop D&D and RPG video stuff. So just appreciate the support there so much. Again, I'm not trying to get rich off anybody. I just, finding the time can be hard. And when I have a certain level of guaranteed support, that makes it easier to justify, a minimum amount per month. And that's just what it comes down to. So thank you again, Chris Williams, and welcome to the Patreon fold. I sent you a message on Patreon. Hope you got that. And, if you want your special Discord role in the Shane Plays Discord channel, just send me a message on Patreon or whatever, and with what your Discord handle is after you've joined the channel, and I will get you hooked up there. So anyway, all right, so let's talk about this. Several years ago, I found this, and I keep printouts of it. I have my little black bag. Well, it's actually a big black bag, a big black bag that I carry all my role-playing materials in for the game that I'm running right then. It's kind of my DM bag. And several years ago, I ran across this. I'm not sure what year this was first published by Creighton, but I ran across it and I thought it was good, and I printed out multiple copies. And I think at the time I actually handed out copies to my group that I was running in D&D, and I said, look, this isn't hard and fast rules or anything. I'm not saying that you're bad players. It's just I thought this was interesting, and I thought you might like to have a copy. And I keep multiple copies in my bag now. So if we have a new player or something like that, I can hand, and if I remember, I can hand it out. Now, again, I'm not saying that these are the hard and fast rules on how to be a good DM or player in D&D. They're just food for thought, and they come from way back when the game was really first getting out there. And they're quoted from the Keep on the Borderlands module, which again it's like a 40-year-old module, something like that. So, but a little bit more on the source itself. I found it at Creighton. I'm thinking it's Creighton. If I'm spelling that incorrectly, somebody let me know, or saying that incorrectly, Creighton or whoever, let me know, and I'll make sure to correct that. It's CreightonBroadhurst.com, and it's a blog from an RPG lover, and he's a publisher of RPG related material at Raging Swan Press. I believe that's the name of it. Yeah, Raging Swan Press, and it looks like they do stuff for 5e, Pathfinder, OSR, System Neutral. They have a blog, a store, all kinds of stuff. And at the top it says, make your campaign more awesome. Get a free copy of the 180-page Thingonomicon by joining us on Patreon. So they have a Patreon as well. And that's at RagingSwanPress.com. I'll put those links in the show notes. But thanks so much for this resource, Creighton. I really appreciate it. So, all right. And he starts off what he's going to say here. He just says, as you know, I'm an old gamer. He's been gaming for a long time. Not only did he cut his teeth on basic D&D and advanced D&D, that kind of me too. But even now, I love returning to the scene of the crime. I do too. I love playing first edition AD&D and basic and expert BX. I love all that stuff. Anyway, so he goes on to say that B2, module B2, Keep on the Borderlands, was designed as an introductory adventure, and it had some special notes for beginning players and DMs or GMs. And so let's start with the DM advice. Let's see if this holds up, and this will be followed by player advice. So there is player advice coming. Let's see here. He says, all the notes below are direct quotes from page 4 of the Keep on the Borderlands. And now Creighton says, I think you'll agree this advice is both timeless and ironically basic, because Keep on the Borderlands was released for the basic version of D&D at the time. So here we go. Does this stuff hold up 40 years later? Do I agree with it? Do I have a different take on it? Do you have a different take on it? But remember, D&D, some things in D&D and our tabletop RPGs don't seem to change. Other things do as the hobby iterates and innovates and other styles of play and things come along. So keep in mind, this is mainly for D&D and very similar tabletop RPGs. This isn't. I guess some of it could apply to any system, but anyway, here we go. So the first one says the DM must be fair. He or she cannot be out to get the players, nor should he or she be on their side all the time. And I think that's a very important point. You're there to help run the game. They used to refer to the DM a lot of times as the referee. You need somebody at the table to make sure that rules discussions have an answer and an arbitration. And then, to run a fun story for everybody. You shouldn't be out to get if you're out to get the players, and adversely, if you're a player out to show up, get the DM, I would respectfully and as humbly as possible suggest that maybe you have I'll just say a wrong approach to the game. If you're playing it in a group, if you're playing it just you and one other person and you all decided you're out to get to each other, that's fine, I suppose. If you're playing a video game and you're out to beat the game. But it should be a balance. The DM should, you're not out to get to pay the player, out to get to players, but you're also not solving everything for them, because that's also not fun for the players. Maybe if you have very young players that you're, introducing into the hobby, be a lot more lenient and helpful. But in general, you're not out to get the players, but you're also not out to do everything for them and make sure they succeed in absolutely everything they do. You're there to referee the adventure and to make sure everybody has a good time. All right, next, if a player has played well and succeeded, the DM should not punish them by sending more and more monsters at them or thwart their plans. So this kind of ties in with the out to get to the players. If the players do well and succeed, you don't want to just keep, I'll show them, and just keep flinging monsters. And when they open the door, they were supposed to get to where they were supposed to be going, but you decide no, that goes somewhere else because you're a little annoyed they did so well. Try not to do that. Now, caveat here, an additional thought. You do want to make sure that the things are balanced and that it's a challenge without being, out to get them. So if you had what you thought was going to be the boss fight or a challenging encounter and they just walked right through it because, maybe you didn't plan it well, or maybe they pulled out a tactic you didn't see coming. There's nothing wrong with, in my opinion anyway, I'll do this. I may add some hit points. I may add in a couple of more monsters just to make it more challenging, but it's not to I'll show you for messing up my encounter. I just want them to feel challenged so they have even more satisfaction in what they've done. Now, this next one I agree with. I think I think these days there may be a little bit of different thought on this one, but I 100% agree with this one. And in fact, I do this as fairly as possible, but I will do this in my games. If the players have acted foolishly, they should get their quote unquote just rewards. Yes, if they are playing foolishly, not if the dice roll went bad, or if they really they came up with a plan based on the best knowledge and information they had at the time, and tried to execute that plan and it went wrong. I'm talking about just doing dumb stuff. I can think of a couple of examples from games I've run in the past few years. And again, players can do, you have to walk that fine line. I'm not going to tell a player you're playing the game wrong. I mean, it's an open-ended game of imagination. But I will say, every now and then I'll step back objectively and say, as the DM, and say, that was foolish given the context and the circumstances. But I won't tell them they can't do it. Here's some examples. That we were playing White Plume Mountain, and there was there's a room in White Plume Mountain. It's one of those funhouse dungeons where the rooms don't always make sense. They're just obstacles to overcome in a lot of cases. And there was a frictionless floor where you stepped on it, off you went. I mean, there was no friction. And it was possible for you to fall into like a pit that had, I think, like broken metal or daggers or glass in it or something. And in another part of the dungeon, they had gotten some kayaks. And so a couple of the players, just for fun, decided to get into the kayak and shoot across. Well, they shot across, slammed into the other wall, almost died, were like laying there like stunned, and a fight broke out in that room, or near that room. One of the two, I can't remember. And the other party was having a really hard time, and those two players, A, not only almost killed themselves, but B, were unable to help the party, and it made things difficult for everybody. So, yeah, if you treat an adventure lightly, in White Plume Mountain and dungeons like that can be very deadly. And they already knew the floor was frictionless. It was their second time coming through. But to me, that was a foolish action. That is not treating things with like the respect of the danger level that's already been established. They're welcome to do it, but I allowed them to suffer their actions. And if they would have died, they would have died. I mean, I told them that, but they didn't, by the dice rolls, by the damage and everything. I had another time a second level paladin charged a adult red dragon when the dragon had not made hostile intent. It was just like looking and talking. And I even threw up a couple of warning flags like, hey, this dragon looks like it's just trying to talk. But he said, that's what my player would do. And he charged. And so I said, okay. And so the dragon did his attacks and killed the player. I didn't try to save the player in that, other than to say, to make it apparent that the dragon looks like it's trying to talk to your party. So those are just a couple of examples. Again, players could do it. I never want to get in and say, you are not allowed to do that. But there is a tone, a set expectation that an adventure or a campaign will kind of imply. And if you do just outright foolish stuff, there was another, that same player went drunk into a royal court and acted crazy, and his player ended up getting killed by the guards. And he was like, wow. I was like, what do you expect? So I'm not going to tell you can't do it, but, I heavily implied the gravity of the situation before he went in there and did that. So it was a very serious moment in the campaign with heavy diplomatic overtones of bad repercussions that could happen for that king. So anyway, all right. So I'm a big fan of, if they act foolishly, let the chips fall where they may. Your mileage may differ. In combat, the DM should play the monsters to the best of the monster's ability. I'm often at fault of not doing that. After a battle, I'll be like, oh man, I'll read up the monster stat block again and be like, oh, I should have had the monster do this, that, or the other. Or sometimes it's like we're getting towards the end of a session and I don't want the battle to prolong. But yes, I think for the players to get maximum enjoyment of the game, you should play the monsters to the best of their ability. There's especially these days, there's a challenge rating. Back in the other, when this was written, they had how many hit dice they had. It was kind of estimated how tough they were. And, also it makes it more interesting. I mean, having playing monsters that just stay there and get hit on till they die is not as interesting or satisfying as monsters that are wise and use tactics and maybe run and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I agree with that one. And this one ties in with if players have acted foolishly, they should get their just rewards. And I think this one actually fits more on the player advice section, but it's listed here on the DM section. So the DM must be fair, but the players must play wisely. And I agree with that. As I've already stated, it's, a lot of people, I think I've seen this sort of tendency that people want the DM or the GM to almost be like a vending machine, to just, they press a button or pull a lever or whatever, and the DM is going to make sure everything's okay. And by, with their choices, or give them whatever they want. And I just, that's not my style, and depending if it's a one shot or something that has a completely different tone, then yeah, sure. I could be a vending machine, but for the most part, I'm not. I'm there to I want to have fun. I want the players to have fun, tell a good story, let them play a good story, that sort of thing. So yeah, you'll see that there's a balance here between the DM's responsibilities and the player's responsibilities. So, and I like that approach personally. It's on the players to play wisely. If they play foolishly and fail and TPK or whatever, it's not up to the DM to fix everything. That doesn't mean that you can't, give them second chances with another opportunity in the game, or have them fail forward or something like that. But it is on the players as well to play wisely. Okay. The DM is also the designer of the situation and must bear in mind the abilities of his or her players. Also, it is the job of the DM to see the situations in character balance. Okay, these two fit together very well. Yes, now here's where it goes back on the DM. It's the job of the DM or the GM to see that the situation and the character's balance. If you take characters of a certain level or of a certain group makeup that don't have the right abilities or a good chance of overcoming a situation, that's not fair to the players. If you're running, you need to keep that in mind. Now, if you told the players, hey, look, you need a well-balanced party, and they all came in as monks, that's on the players. That goes back to the players must play wisely. But if they've, if they've done their characters the way you you gave them their guidelines before the campaign or adventure started, they've done their characters, you need to bear that in mind when you're doing their situations they need to overcome. I totally 100% agree with that. And, you must bear in mind the abilities of his or her players. If there's a lock that must be picked, or a trap that must be found, or a magical something that must be detected, and nobody in the party can do that, or at least do it very well, how is that fair to the players? So, adjust as needed. Adjust as needed. But if you're designing encounters, take that into account beforehand. If you're running a pre-published adventure, maybe does that adventure fit this group? Or maybe make some changes to it. Not so that they will win no matter what, but so that it fits their group makeup, the party abilities, that sort of thing. As DM, much satisfaction comes from watching players overcome a difficult situation, but they should do it on their own. So, yeah, you got to say it's hard sometimes as a DM not to just solve it for them. But you got to sit back. And now if they're just really fumbling and they can't get past it, and it's critical that they get past this part for the adventure, maybe devise a way that they could still accomplish it on their own without just giving it to them. But very rarely should you just say, okay, guys, here, here's the deal. Let them overcome it on their own. But this next thing fits into this. It says to defeat monsters and overcome problems, the DM must be a dispenser of information. I mean, you got to give them enough information to succeed. You can't just, I know that what it takes to succeed here, but I'm not going to tell them, and then they flail around forever and they have no chance of finding out. Good example of that is back in the 80s, I played with this group a couple of times, and there was this one situation where the password to something, I don't know what it was, I wasn't there when it happened, it was a story I was told later, was Ronald Reagan on the flip side of a Motown record. Now, yeah, you could say, hey, there was a password, but how is anybody going to guess that? And the only way you're going to guess that is like a computer algorithm brute forcing it. You're not just going to, what is the password for this stuff? Ronald Reagan on the flip side of a Motown record. So it's a perfect example. And the DM was like, well, there was a password, but no, that's, and I don't think anybody was mad about it. They thought it was funny or something like that. But it's a good example of, you've got to give them enough information. If they have no chance of getting it, that's just not cool. Why are you doing that? I don't get it. Unless you're trying to show that that's not the way to go right now. Let them fumble with it for a while and they'll get the password later or something. I don't know. The players, here we go, must be allowed to make their own choices. Yes. Now, that doesn't mean a story can't be linear. They can make their choices about how they approach the story. That doesn't mean everything has to be an ultimate sandbox. Linear storytelling can sometimes be fun. You go from A to B to C to D to the end, but it's how do you solve those things or overcome those fights to get there. So the players must they must be able to make their own choices. Very rarely will I narrate what happens to a player. And if I do, I will go out of my way to talk with a group of the players and say, in this instance, I'm going to montage something, or I'm going to kind of narrate what happens, or I'm going to set something up so that everybody can react to it. But your character may do something or, not do something until it's time to act. But I never just spring it on players. I'll talk with the group. I'll say, is this okay? And that sort of, because you don't want to take agency away from the player. It's a big thing. Players want to run their characters how they want. All right. And then this one ties in with the DM must be a dispenser of information. It's important the DM give accurate information. So don't give false information just to be a jerk. You might think it's funny, but your players probably won't. Watch them fumble around. Now, if you're playing an NPC or a monster or a situation that is intended to be deceitful, that's different. But just as the DM in general, you need to give them accurate information about what's happening or what they need to know. And then finally, and this has changed a lot depending on the system or the style of play. But I think for D&D and similar type tabletop RPGs, Pathfinder, others that require a very strong DM, GM, referee type role, it says the DM must remember that he or she is in control. That doesn't mean you're like, ultimate power. Although you kind of do, but you don't want to abuse it. But that means ultimately, and you'll see this on the other list, is the DM is always right. Number 2, refer to Rule 1. And that's kind of a overly hard way of putting it, but ultimately somebody at the table needs to arbitrate the rules and decide. There could be discussion. There could, and a DM should listen to other opinions and consider everything. But eventually the game must move on and a decision must be made, and that falls to the DM. It is a special role. Out of everybody at the table, the DM has a unique role out of everybody at the table. That doesn't mean they're more important as intrinsically value as a person. they're not a better person. They may as well have a different role, and their role is ultimately the buck stops with the DM. Now, there's some games out there where it's more collaborative, and sometimes the DM role will go from person to person to person, different sessions and different, like, oh, this encounter, now you're the DM or GM or whatever. But I'm talking about, when you're playing D&D or a similar type game, which needs like a GM, DM, castle keeper, referee, whatever, lore keeper, whatever. I guess a game with a lore keeper would fit. I don't know. So if lore keeper doesn't fit, you don't have to worry about sending me angry email or anything. They're in control. The DM is running the table. So, that is, hopefully they're not being jerks about it. Hopefully they're not drunk on power or, too, I don't know, ham-fisted or something. But ultimately the buck stops with the DM, and he or she is in control of the game as far as the ultimate boundaries of the game and certain decisions. So if players, this is on the player side, but players have to respect that. If a player can't respect that, they probably don't need to be at the table. Okay, now, according to Creighton in his blog post here, he goes on to say, it's good to see the basic role of the GM hasn't really changed all that much over the last 40 years or so. I think it's fair to say the dynamics and size of most groups has changed over the last 4 decades, but a GM of today, reading the list above, could implement all of Gary's suggestions. So Gary Gygax writing this for Keep on the Borderlands. In fact, I'd argue every GM should follow his advice. It depends on the game you're playing and the style of game and the game your players want to play. But yeah, if you're playing straight D&D as intended, then yeah, I think this is good advice to follow. I'm not talking about games like, I don't know. There's all these unique game systems out there that approach how the players collaborate differently. But I'm not talking about those kind of games. I'm talking about D&D and D&D style games as we think of them, as they're generally understood to be. Okay. Next up is the advice. Well, he goes on, Creighton goes on to say the only piece of advice he slightly disagrees with is it is the job of the DM to see that situations in character balance. I agree with that up to the point, but I'll add the caveat unless the players do something stupid. But that's already covered, and it is up to the players to play wisely. And, if they do foolish things, they suffer their just rewards that we already talked about. All right, now let's get to the player side of things. This is from page 25 of the Keep on the Borderlands. The DM advice is from page 4. Creighton says, I think you'll agree this advice is both timeless and ironically basic. I think I mentioned that before towards the earlier because of the BX basic expert rules. Okay. Here we go. And I think some of this has changed a little bit just due to the more fluid nature of character and class roles in D&D. But everything else I think is pretty spot on. I'll expand on what I just was trying to say here in a second. All right, players should be organized and cooperative. Yes. Unless you're playing a game which specifically the players are out to get each other in some fashion, and I'm not saying that couldn't happen. I mean, back in the day, it was much more common to me to hear, well, this player, their thief stole stuff from the other player, or they got into a fight in game, and I guess it still happens. It's happened in one of my games, and that player ended up leaving a couple of sessions later, not over that, but they just proved themselves to not be a good player, and they asked to do something, and I said, no, not tonight, we'll look at it next session. They never came back, so that one solved itself. But yeah, in general, players should be organized and cooperative. It shows a lot of this stuff about the DM and the player advice. A lot of it comes down to everybody's there to do something and have fun, and there are written and unwritten rules on how to achieve that and how to show respect to your fellow player. And one of them, players should be organized and cooperative. Be organized. Know where your stuff is at. be on time, cooperate with each other. You're not there as a lone wolf. You're not there playing a single player computer role playing game. You're there with a group trying to achieve a common purpose, which is to have fun playing a Dungeons & Dragons story, another role playing game kind of story. Okay, next, and this kind of comes with organized and cooperative, each player should have complete information on his or her character easily on hand. And I don't run into that problem very much. People usually have the character sheets or whatever. These days, a lot of my players use D&D Beyond. With COVID and everything, we've been playing on Roll20, so a lot of them have their character stuff and formulas and stuff set up in Roll20, so it's usually not a problem. About the only thing I'll run into, and I'll do it too, I'll be like, how does that spell work again? And I'll have to look up that spell. But now as a DM, I got a lot more spells to keep up with than a player. So if you're a player and you have a spell on your spell list, try to be aware of the specifics of it, so we don't have to slow the game down and look something up if you can. Okay, here's a big one. Players should work together to use their abilities effectively. Again, you're not there as a lone wolf. You're not there to be the superstar. You're there to be part of a group and cooperatively overcome challenges and obstacles and combats and that sort of thing. Sometimes that's out of character thinking at the table. Sometimes that's in character, role-playing or combat at the table. But you're there to use your abilities effectively. Now, this is one of those things that this dynamic has changed a little bit in the past 40 years. That doesn't mean it's not still important to cooperate and use your abilities effectively. But back in the day, party balance, I would strongly argue, was more important than it is today. And what I mean by that, not that you still don't need a good makeup of different classes and abilities, but back in the day, only a thief could do certain things, and that was just it. There are rogues now, but only a thief could do thieving stuff, pickpockets and pick locks and disarm. Only a thief could do it. Or you could multi-class if you're playing like first edition or something. Only clerics could do certain things. You didn't have paladins at this time. You didn't have these kind of super classes. You had fighter, cleric, thief. You had a dwarf was a class. This is in basic expert. Elf was a class, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a class or something, but that was, and they all had very specific roles. Your fighter was your fighter. Okay, you didn't roll in with your wizard you had built a certain way to be a good fighter. You just didn't do that. So the makeup of the party was very important. You didn't want to go in with all fighters. You wanted to have a magic, or you wanted to have a magic user. You wanted to have a fighter or two. You want to have a cleric. You want to have a thief. You wanted to have a good rounded out party. But this still applies because you want to make sure that you have a good makeup of a current party that can do things. You need to be able to find traps and pick locks and do healing and this and that and the other, but it's just a little bit more fluid who can do what now by the way you can build characters in D&D these days. Of course, you can always multi-class and that sort of thing. But this kind of ties in. This isn't, I don't know if you can hear that thunder or not, but it's thundering a little bit outside, reinforcing how important this point is. Let other players shine. And that's not written here. This is me adding on to this. I had a player one time that, we had a rogue in the party, but they had like a wizard or a sorcerer or something. And every time it came time to sneak or to listen or to pickpockets or not pickpockets, but to disarm traps or something, before the rogue could do anything, that sorcerer or whatever, I'll do that. And they just would always jump in and do everything. And I think they just enjoyed their character being a jack of all trades. But at the same time, they were, unintentionally, I'm assuming, diminishing other people's chance to shine. So, as a DM, one thing that I could have added to that list we went through for the DMs is give people an opportunity to shine. Unless I have a player that likes to hang back at the table. They don't need to be, they're cool speaking up when they speak up, and they're cool otherwise. I'm like, okay, I don't just shine the spotlight on them. But everybody else, I try to give them moments to shine. So if you're a player and you're a cleric who can pick locks, and there's another character in the party that's better at it, or that's more their role, maybe let them do it. Unless you've talked with them and they're like, I don't care, you can do it. So, okay, here's the next one. Arguing among players will cause delays, attract monsters, and often result in the deaths or some or all of the members. Now, arguing among players is going to happen sometimes. My group doesn't necessarily argue very much, but they will occasionally have different viewpoints and debate it through. There's very rarely actual tension or arguing. But if there is, try to move it along as quickly as possible, because everyone's is there to have fun. And those arguments, people can, they could hold grudges and stuff like that. And it just is better to just try to solve it and move forward. And a good way to do that, you could cause delays. I love this attract monsters. I've actually had groups trying to work something out, and I'm like, is this table talk? Or is this, I'm just going to go and pull these out of my ears. I don't know. Is this tabletop talk, or is this in character or whatever? And, I have had moments where I'm like, oh, well, the ruckus has attracted whatever. And I think that's a good way to break the tension. If they're just yeah-yeah each other, is have an encounter or something happen that shifts their attention to that. I'm not saying don't let them discuss stuff. I mean, groups need to discuss stuff. In fact, I encourage that. There's times where I'm like, hey, what do y'all want to do? And one person speaks up and everybody's quiet. I'm like, okay, well, I've heard from one player, but I haven't heard from everybody else. So do you have a consensus? And I'll encourage them to talk about things. But yeah, don't just let there be and there's a recurring weekly arguing that has to be dealt with. Somebody or somebodies either needs to change their behavior or leave the table. And sometimes the DM has to come in and try to rectify that. Now, I never just immediately kick somebody out, but if it's obvious that there's one person or more than one person that is the recurring problem, try to talk to them privately. And if nothing changes after a little while, you could ask them to leave. Because people are there to have a good time, not for people to be right. That's one of my sayings anyway. Okay, cooperation should also be given to the DM on the player's side. Discuss with the DM, debate with the DM, but at a certain point when the DM says, okay, that's how we're going to do it, maybe we can talk about it after the game or something. That's how we're going to do it. Just go with the DM. The DM is there for a reason. And you have to cooperate with the DM just like you have to cooperate with the other players. Because, unless there's something just tragically wrong, the DM is cooperating with you. All right. The game, this one is so important. So important. I used to be, I don't know if I was a rules lawyer or whatever, but I love the rules. I love the math. I like to see things interact. I still like the rules. I think it's fun to see how they all fit together. But the game should be fun for all involved. Everyone's there to have fun at the end of the day. It doesn't mean you just, chuck the rules. But make sure everybody's having fun. You can have rules and everybody having fun at the same time. And one of the ways to make sure people are having fun is give everyone an opportunity to shine. And fit the game, match the situations and encounters to the party within reason. Okay, here's another player thing. Caution is also necessary and is a part of planning. I think this was even more important back in the day because, it was much more dungeon oriented. It was one chamber after another. And parties or players that tended to just kick the door open and run in tended to cause a lot of problems. So, but this still applies. Caution is necessary or is also necessary in a part of planning. A party that charges forward without preparation is almost certainly doomed. And yeah, I mean, today, yes, but to a greater extent, the game was much less forgiving. I mean, you could, first level character could die easy in the first battle. I joke around, back in the day, you didn't name your character until third level. It was real easy to get one-shotted and die, depending on the hit points you rolled and stuff like that. The game today, it can still happen, but it's much more forgiving on lower level characters. So, but it also goes on to say too much caution is as dangerous as too little. A party that's just afraid to do anything, you're gonna have to break them out of that somehow. Either make not make it easy, but hopefully that the encounters you're putting them in are rewarding enough when they're done that they want to take that risk. But if they're just never want to go in, yeah, I mean, you've got to eventually, I literally will occasionally, after I've given the party plenty of time to talk and think, and they're just being quiet, I'll literally go like, okay, guys, I got to have a decision. 10, 9, 8. I did that in my most recent session. Now, I don't do that very often, but if they're just can't make a decision, or they're worried of moving forward, and it's just coming to paralysis by analysis, I'll be like, okay, you got a minute, or you got, let's do the Jeopardy music, Final Jeopardy, whatever, to make the point that you got to have a decision. I mean, I'm not going to sit there for 2 hours while they just look at each other like, what should we do? That's not fun for anybody, especially the DM. And the DM is there to have fun too. I think that's a pretty important rule for players to understand, and DMs. The DM is a player, although with a special role, but they're there to have fun too. I'm not there just to service the players. I'm there to have fun too. But I have my fun by doing all the things the DM is supposed to do and watching the players have a good time. Okay, then it goes on to say, above all, a player must think. The game is designed to challenge the minds and imaginations of the players. Those who tackle problems and use their abilities, wits, and new ideas will succeed more often than fail. Yes, role-playing, D&D, these games are about the mind. It is designed, yes, there's combat, and I love the combat, and I love the tactical combat, and I love all this and that and the other, but it is a challenge to the minds and the imagination of the players. So players, challenge, use your minds, use your imaginations, tackle the problems, use your abilities, try to think outside the box. Confound your DM by thinking of something that they didn't. And enjoy that little zap to the brain of, a little hit of dopamine for succeeding or coming up with something cool. And then last, it says the challenge of thinking is a great deal of the fun of the game. So Gary Gygax is saying it's not just a war game, even though maybe have miniatures and monsters and dice, but think, have fun. And I would at the end of the day, I would add to the DMs, have fun, to the players, have fun. If you're not having, I'm not talking about, some sessions are not going to be as good as others. Don't make or break a campaign or a DM or a player or whatever on one session. But over time, there should be a trend of having fun. If you're not having fun, change something up. Maybe a different game, maybe a different DM, maybe take a break, whatever. Dissolve the party, whatever. But if you're not having fun, what's the point? Has to be some fun. And people come out, well, they're using D&D for therapy, or they're using D&D to teach things. Okay, I get that. Yeah, that's a different thing. I'm just talking about if it's friends or people getting together purely for playing a game and having fun. If you're not having fun, what's the point? So have fun. I'll add one other thing. I've mentioned this before I have a article up on shameplays.com, and I think I did a radio or one of my podcasts around it. One of the ways you can know you're doing a good job as a DM, it's in my opinion, a foolproof way, is it doesn't matter what people tell you or say or this or that or the other. If your players keep showing up, you're probably doing a good job and people are having fun. And, same thing with the players, try to have fun. You're there to have fun. If you're not having fun, is there something you can do different to make it more fun? Or, is there not? Because if you're not having fun and you can't change that, maybe you need to drop out and find a different group or do something different. I'm not saying just because you're having fun, you got to go, but I'm saying sometimes the problem is like, there's a thing called a fit, right? It applies for all kinds of groups of individuals, jobs, teams, games, whatever. And you could be a wonderful person, and everybody else could be a wonderful person. But somebody or the group dynamic may not be a good fit. So if it just feels like you're just banging your head and it's never becoming fun, you might want to try a different group, because that group could be, through no fault of anyone, a better fit for you. So anyway, all right. And Creighton goes on to say, I think pretty much all the advice is still relevant today. While the games many of us play nowadays have evolved to be more complex, more tactical, and more option-rich, they're essentially the same games. Yeah, for the most part. And he says he thinks that it's a good day. So what do you think? I want to hear, he ends his blog the same way. I've kind of shared my thoughts on, is this stuff still relevant? I would love in the comments for you to share. Do you think this is still relevant? Do you have anything you want to add to the list for DMs or players? Do you have anything you want to remove? Do you have anything you particularly agree with or don't agree with? I would love to hear it. But anyway, that was Timeless Advice from Keep on the Borderlands by Creighton Broadhurst. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching. I always appreciate that, and I love getting comments on these D&D and RPG videos. Hope this was helpful to you somehow. Love to hear your feedback. I mean, you've probably got something you can share with me that will help me, so please do. And other than that, just again, thanks for watching, and we will catch you next time on Shane Plays.